because they were in opposition. It's easy to be in opposition, Bob. It's easy. Now they're in government, and they have to come to grips with some very important social and political forces and institutions inside Egypt. Parties change when they come into office and they form governments, and we're beginning to see that. The second theme, and I don't know how much time somebody will tell me, the second theme is that there are large, poor populations in all these countries. Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, Palestine. And there, for them, dignity means jobs. Jobs. It is not even the growth of the economy that matters, because Egypt actually, in the last 7 or 8 years of the Mubarak regime, was growing at 6% a year, which is a fairly reasonable growth rate. But unemployment and underemployment in young people in these countries is the real figures, we have trouble because the real economy is difficult, but it's somewhere between 40 and 50% for young people under 30. And people have often asked me, and I'm not going to talk about any security issues in this, because that's not what we're talking about today, but people often ask me what the biggest security threat in the Middle East is. And they expect me to answer nuclear proliferation. It is unemployed young men who see no future for themselves. That is the big, and that is top of mind for the Ikhwan and for Al-Ghanoush in Tunisia right now. And what I worry most about right now, frankly, is I don't see an industrial strategy or an agricultural strategy being discussed by the government of Egypt. They don't have endless time. And they too will disappoint if they don't really come to grips with the challenge of creating jobs in Egypt. That is the #1 challenge that this government is facing. Finally, there is a deep and growing religious divide. And whether I call it religious is not the right word, but I can't find the right word. So let me put it this way. There's a deep and growing marker of identity divide between Sunni and Shia in the Arab world, which is deepening. It is splitting the world, the Arab world, in pieces. It's obvious and it's violent in Syria and Lebanon, but it is much broader. It's latent in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia. It divides Iran from the Sunni Arab heartland, and this is a deepening and explosive divide which is going on in the Arab world. And finally, to fill out the picture, the militaries are not going anywhere in the Middle East. They are deeply institutionalized. In many ways, they are very large and important players in the economy. They have very large institutional interests, and they have access to funding. So what we will see over the next 5 years in the context of a discussion about theocratic democracy is what role military institutions play, and how, and Egypt is the most interesting case here, and here the drama is real, gripping, and fascinating. What role does President Morsi have to give to the military, and what privileges, in order to keep the Egyptian military in the barracks? That's the challenge for him, and he's not the first president of a young democracy. Look at Latin America in the 80s and the 90s. That was the overwhelming question. That will be a question in the Arab world as well. So we do not have now in the Arab world a stable status quo, but that is good, because one does not build for the future on stable autocracy and kleptocratic governments, which is what we had. So we have instability, we have uncertainty, but after almost 40 years, there is space for politics. Young people, and for me that is the biggest marker of all, young people in the Arab world can talk politics without the fear of arrest and imprisonment, at least in some part of the Arab world. So let me conclude with a heretical thought. My good friend Nachman Ben Yehuda, who is one of Israel's most outstanding sociologists, was here this past week at the Monk School. He's an Israel Prize winner. his lectures about Israel as a theocratic democracy. That's what he called it. And, oh, I heard an oi out of my right ear. You know, I hope Shira's going to push us on this. Because if you think the bias is on one side, folks, it ain't. There is a Jewish religious tradition, which is real, an important part of people's lives. So dismissing it from a position of Western superiority may well be an act of hubris, especially as the West begins to look at itself now in a different world where religious voices all over the world are not doing what we Westerners once thought would happen. Go away. That's what we thought would happen to religion. Well, we're wrong. And we are in the minority in this world now with respect to religious voices. So this discussion of how you build a theocratic democracy is the discussion of the next. It's not only for the Arab world, it's a discussion for Israel too. One thing I know for sure, it's not by making women go sit at the back of the bus, right? I know that for sure. But it's also not by pretending that religious tradition and religious observance is not a fundamental part of the Jewish state, and that political accommodation has to engage beyond what we in the West, who live in a society which draws on a Christian tradition, and I'll say it again, a Christian tradition which separates church and state, but thinks that that tradition speaks to the whole world. It doesn't.
In just a moment, after Janice's question and answer period, there'll be an opportunity for us to hear from all three in a dialogue which will be moderated by our good friend Shira. But I just wanted to give Janice the chance to answer a few questions. I've already had a few brought up to me, and this one just requires about a 2-minute answer. Is Iran the outlier, or has it been going through the same process as what is occurring elsewhere in the Middle East? So just give us your five-minute answer on Iran, if you could, Janice.
So, Bob, let me take the discussion of Iran from the perspective of its internal politics rather than what it's doing internationally.
I think that's what we're looking for.
Yeah. Iran actually, I think, mirrors the contradictions of what we've been talking about, and that's why I say it's such a hard conversation. Iran, when the Shah came to Iran as a modernizer, right, but actually failed, and failed for reasons that occur over and over and over, that without robust democratic institutions, leaders fail to get the kind of information and knowledge that they need. They're isolated from the people that they lead, and despite the fact that he was about bringing Iran into the modern era and building a modern economy, he fell victim to what all autocratic leaders fall victim to sooner or later: corruption and isolation, and he was overthrown. And you got a militant Shia regime in Iran, and Shia has aspects of his political culture which are very, very different from Sunnis, and there was a period really of religious exclusivity. There was no pluralism in Iran religiously. Well, that regime is exhausted in terms of its moral authority. It's exhausted itself, which, in a sense, for people who worry about religious militancy which makes no room for anybody else, is a very encouraging thing, I think, to see. And when you talk to young Iranians, they, by the way, do not want a government that is not theocratic. They want a different kind of theocratic government. which is a different answer than we normally get here, okay? But here's the contradiction. As the regime becomes more isolated, more embattled, what does it do? It uses every instrument of oppression against its own people. And we saw that in the most brutal way with the Bashish in 2009. But that's what the government of al-Assad is doing too. So governments, and that's where democracy is absolutely crucial. Any theocratic, there is no democracy in either of those two societies. So the trajectory toward theocratic democracy is hugely important. All my Iranian friends in this city, who, by the way, many of them came when the Shah was overthrown, hate this government because they're refugees from that country. And we're absolutely convinced that 2008, 2000 was the end, right? I'm sure Bob heard that too. I wasn't. Because you look at the instruments, the paramilitary instruments of repression. And if a government is willing to use those, as tough as it is if you're a young woman in uniform and you look around and